Welcome back to another episode of the BioHub, where we talk to some of the top minds in biotech. Joining us today is Rob Etherington, CEO of Clene, Nanomedicine. Rob brings over 30 years of experience in pharma, including 9 years at Parke-Davis, a division of Pfizer, 13 years at Actelion, where he was part of the team that took the company public, and now 11 years leading Clene. At Clene, he's at the forefront of using nanotechnology to tackle neurodegenerative diseases. Rob, I'm really excited to have you on the show. How are you?
Fine, Max. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure's all mine. Let's just get straight into it. So, Rob, could you kick things off by telling us about the moment you realised Clene's technology could have truly revolutionized the way that we approach diseases like motor neuron disease?
Certainly. I'm holding in my hand an example of the oral nanosuspension. This is actually a similar bottle that our patients are now drinking every morning in our clinical studies. So the notion of drinking a nanotherapeutic is a novel concept. And our founder, Mark Mortensen, figured out that if we could take something that could serve as a catalyst to drive the energetic metabolite change that your brain and mine relies upon for energy, and take this asset as an oral medicine that would go into the gut, be coated by a protein albumin corona to enable bloodborne transport up to the CNS, up to the central nervous system, up to the brain, and drive the energy that a brain under the devastating assault of a neurodegenerative disease such as MS, or in particular ALS, or called outside the United States motor neuron disease, then this could be a major breakthrough. So we've been focused on this, as you noted just a minute ago, Max, for 11 years. The idea that patients who are struggling with functional deficit because the disease, and there's multiple neurodegenerative diseases, the disease is attacking their brain and their central nervous system, causing a compromise in function and the way the neurons work, could be a major, major breakthrough. And this is very relevant because the World Health Organization is predicting that neurodegenerative disease will become the second most prevalent cause of death in the next couple decades. There's a lot of things we've solved because of the advent of pharmaceutical therapies. We've made great progress with cancer, great progress with diabetes, great progress with cardiovascular disease, great progress with anti-infective challenges. All of those remain problems, to be clear. Cancer, cardiovascular disease, COVID are all examples of problems we've not totally solved. So I don't mean to overstate the point, but the brain remains in large measure still a bit of a mystery. And the central nervous system still is quite compromising when it's under attack to folks, patients of all different types worldwide. And so really what I'm saying is a therapeutic breakthrough is urgently needed. And Clene's been working to be at the forefront of this need.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. Well, why do you think, I suppose, the brain and neurological diseases are that little bit more behind? Is it just more complex, or?
Part of it is the complexity. Part of it is that we don't fully understand, the brain. We don't fully understand the central nervous system in full measure. But also, there is a lot going on. There's this. I like to call it a symphony or an orchestra that needs to happily work in the brain and in the central nervous system. And thinking about this kind of down to the base level. Your brain and mind is only about 3 to 5% of our body weight, yet it's consuming a remarkable amount of energy day in, day out. About 25% of our daily energy requirements are really organized to keep all that electrical activity, managing a choreography of muscles that enable us to move and to walk and to eat and to drink and to talk and to sleep and to think and to breathe. I mean, I can go on. Everything that you and I take for granted. And in neurodegenerative diseases in particular, there's many things that are causing a pathogenic insult. And that is one of the challenges, is that even some of these diseases, like motor neuron disease or ALS, we don't understand fully the causes. There are some, in somewhat rare fashion, thankfully, genetic causes. But on balance, it's difficult to predict ALS. It could affect somebody in their 20s, their 30s, their 70s, their 50s. And then when it affects them, the devastation is extraordinary in motor neuron slash ALS disease. Impaired mitochondrial activity and compromised cellular metabolism can lead to neuronal death, among other things. And when the neurons die, then the neurons stop doing what they're supposed to do, which
Hmm.
is, give the signals to muscles to continue to function. And when that happens in my arms and legs, I can't walk. When that happens in my lungs, I can't breathe. And so, taken together, a massive series of therapeutic medical needs still remain. Now, let's change gears slightly to multiple sclerosis. There's a lot of progress we've made there. MS used to be considered a fatal disease as well, but now it's chronic, it's manageable. There is a number of disease modifying therapies that prevent the body from attacking itself, which is what often
Hmm.
happens in MS. But still, a therapeutic breakthrough is needed there because patients with multiple sclerosis still have functional deficit, the way they walk, the way they see because of lesions on their optic nerve, the way they think because of lesions in their cerebral white matter, the way they move fine motor skills. All of that could be compromised despite the fact that the MS disease is controlled. So,
Hmm.
uh, there's two examples. I'll give a third: Parkinson's. We've done some good work with therapies to prevent the Parkinson shake, but still Parkinson is very debilitating, and not everybody responds to the medicines we have available. And as the famous actor Michael J. Fox, who has spent his last few decades championing drug development for Parkinson's and understanding of the science, will tell us, there is much progress that still needs to be made. So back to Clene. So we're really focused here on improving mitochondrial health and protecting the function of the neuron to treat neurodegenerative diseases, plural, with our key focus being ALS and MS to begin.
Yeah, it's crazy how transferable that technology is as well. It's like across all those diseases.
Well, it's let's talk about that for a moment. Then again,
Yeah, yeah.
what we're doing with nanotherapeutics. So, as I've stated now more than once, all neurodegenerative diseases involve neuronal death, and that neuron is dying. So, the ability of the neuron to do its work is dying. And the challenge with all these diseases is when the neuron dies, there's this convergent on the death because of either it doesn't have enough energy to fight back against an insult,
Hmm.
or the mitochondria doesn't have enough energy to do its basic work. And our particular approach is to take gold. And when I say gold, I don't mean gold like a wedding ring, although that's a good metaphor. I mean gold at nanoscale. And so when I say nanoscale, something so small that it's composed of atoms of gold within a crystal structure that is so small it could cross the blood-brain barrier, so small that it could be taken by mouth orally. This drug asset has no taste, other than if I was blindfolded and I was drinking my water glass or our CNMAU8, I would think that it was water. In fact, in all of our clinical data, placebo is in fact purple colored water. One of the challenges we had was to find a purple dye to match the placebo appearance of the actual drug. As you see, it looks purple,
Yeah.
and that purple dye, we had to be careful, didn't have a taste profile, so the patients didn't get inadvertently unblinded because they recognized they were taking placebo because of its the taste of the dye. Some food dyes have a slight taste. But in any event, our asset tastes like water because it's mostly composed of water. Water is the vehicle through which we administer trillions of nanocrystals that are 13 nanometers size. That means 1,000 could fit on the side of a human hair and get into the brain. And what's going on when our asset is being used? And we use gold because gold is highly catalytically active. So if we harken back to our high school chemistry class, what does a catalyst do? It lowers an activation energy to achieve a different energy. So the surface catalysis of CNMAU8, as the patients take this orally, improves mitochondrial function. And by improving mitochondrial function, the goal is to also help the neurons survive and function. So that's occurring because we are able to improve nicotinamide dinucleotide, which is a key bioenergetic metabolite that you and I rely upon for energy. We're able to normalize ATP, which is a key bioenergetic metabolite that you and I rely upon for energy. And we're able to reduce reactive oxygen species, which is a byproduct of energy within the mitochondria. And so if we can do those things, then what we've got is brain engagement and a targeting of energy metabolism in these diseases.
That's incredible. Yeah, amazing. I suppose slightly different subject now, but looking at your background and transitioning from big pharma to a startup, what was the defining moment that made you decide to go to Clene?
Well, as you mentioned early on, I spent the first 9 years at a division of now Pfizer. I was working in cardiovascular disease, working in spaces that now as a well-known drug, Lipitor, that is almost a household name to reduce cholesterol. So I started off in big pharma with classic big pharma infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I went from, which means a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of worldwide commercialization and clinical development effort. And I joined a small startup called Actelion. I joined that startup in the year that we took Actelion public. Actelion was a drug company that nobody had heard of. We focused originally in a different cardiovascular disease area, but it became very obvious very fast at Actelion that we needed to focus on pulmonary arterial hypertension based upon data that we were receiving. That's a very rare orphan disease. Before we started working in PAH, most patients had to get on a heart-lung transplant list or they would pass away quickly. Now, there are many drugs that work for pulmonary arterial hypertension, many that Actelion developed and a number that other companies developed. So I saw this transition working at a rare orphan space where everybody was effectively given a death sentence to where now PAH is more chronic and more manageable, no longer the fatal diagnosis that 25 years ago patients would have received. And so here at Clene, this is another opportunity to start something out of the box from scratch and do something, in this case, remarkably novel. And I say remarkably novel is because we had, the drug development is either small molecule, if you will, recipes of chemistry. Lipitor is a classic example of this, where we take chemistry and we, mix it in a vat effectively and then stamp it into a pill and give it a little bit of a coating so it can be taken by mouth orally. This is what we're doing at Clene is not this. Then there was the biotech era, which still continues aggressively and frankly with so much progress and so much promise. And this is where we basically bioengineer solutions to problems, and this is done, in quite complex arenas. We're not that either. What we're doing is intersecting biology with material science and with effectively physics, because what we're doing with our asset is we're taking, in this case, a therapeutic element, gold, that has had understood medicinal properties for some time, but not really practically. And so we've done this now by taking it down to nanoscale, which is, that is to say, so small at the atomic level that the asset can actually enter, and we have evidence of this in the brain. And we can actually see target engagement, blood-brain penetration, and we can see that on CNS, central nervous system biomarkers, we can drive the energetic effects that I've just talked about needing to be driven in human patients that struggle, and participants that participate that either have Parkinson's or early MS or stable MS rather, or ALS as well.
Nice. And this is really fascinating as well. What are the most challenging aspects of development treatments for motor neuron disease, and how Clene is actually navigating these challenges?
Well, that actually is both a strength and a weakness of neurodegenerative diseases. Is in our case is that there's multiple diseases, all of which have a different kind of, if you will, history. There's a series of different pathogenic insults that converge to cause these diseases. And that's the challenge, is figuring out how to resolve that. That's why in many cases, ALS, for example, there's been a lot of attempts and a lot of failure, because getting at how to solve the ALS disease when we don't even understand categorically, concretely, comprehensively how ALS is really happening is a big challenge for all clinical drug developers and scientists. The fact that we have one asset that can work potentially across a few diseases, and we've announced data already in MS and ALS is one advantage, but that we have. But back to the point, the challenge is pretty significant, because there's just a lot of different things going on based upon what disease we're talking about, and how to find one approach to resolve that is actually challenging to almost arguably not possible, one approach. So really, we envision that there'll be multiple drug therapies that will be needed to actually resolve these really vexing, devastating conditions like ALS. Patients will have to have one medicine to accomplish one aspect, another medicine to accomplish another, and they'll probably need to work in concert. And that is, in fact, what has been happening over the last few years. But we've had even the particular challenge that phase 2 data has not been able to be replicated in larger phase 3 studies with a few drugs. And so today, as we stand, there's really only one or arguably two drugs available in different markets worldwide to treat ALS. And so that's why a number of us, Clene included, are aggressively working night and day to try to bring more drugs to these patients who desperately need them.
Yeah, and that feeds on perfectly to the next question. In terms of FDA accelerated approval, how that could be game changing. How does that process look for you, and what are the implications for bringing your treatments to patients that bit sooner?
Well, first, it's a little history. So the FDA really organized this idea of accelerated approval back in the early 90s. It came originally at the advent of the AIDS crisis, when we had patients passing away for inexplicable reasons, and it became very obvious that there needed to be a concerted effort to figure out how to get drugs to market to prevent these HIV patients from passing away aggressively. And so the agency organized accelerated approval in kind of its origin story to enable different endpoints that could include biomarkers to actually argue that there could be an acceleration of an approval, even whilst the rest of the clinical program continued.
Okay.
And the agency has demonstrated regulatory flexibility in a number of areas in the United States, including oncology as well, where the idea that a drug may work, we have early signals that suggest it does. We have biomarkers that teach us there is something going on, and we could approve the drug, if you will, conditional. And that's not exactly the right phrase. Other countries like Canada actually call it a conditional approval, which means it's conditional on some other data. In the FDA's case, there is a requirement there be a larger phase 3 study that be concluded, and if that data is positive as well, then it adds to the clinical record and supports the approval, and one could move into a full approval status. If it's not positive, then the thesis is the drug would be pulled.
Okay.
And we've had that exact thing happen in the United States only within the last few months in ALS, where a large phase 3 study was negative, and so by consequence, the company pulled their drug off the market. But that is an example of the challenges still facing ALS, is since we still are seeking to understand how the disease works, and that we need to get data from smaller studies to translate to larger studies, that all needs to be correlated together. Now, back to your original question, how does the accelerated approval process work? Well, Clene has missed its primary endpoints in our clinical program. So the primary endpoint is ALS-FRS. That stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis functional response scale. The FRS is functional response. And it's basically a measure of how I can do a number of things that you and I take for granted every day. How I can talk, how I can feed myself, how I can dress, how I can manage my sleeping, how I can breathe at night, etc. And I get a series of scores that I give myself based upon my ability to do this in a range from up to 4 points to less than that. Anyway, we missed that ALS-FRS endpoint, but we saw in our secondary and our exploratory endpoints, we saw improvement in clinical function in terms of the way I breathe, the way I can still swallow, and we saw a lot of survival data where patients were not passing away. We also saw a biomarker neurofilament change, which as the neuron is attacked by the ALS disease, it leaves, if you will, kind of metaphorically, a debris filled in the serum and the plasma of the blood. We can measure that. And so we would see the neurofilament rise. And so we are going back to the agency and chatting with them about our mechanism, our biomarker data, how that correlates together, what the survival data is seeing across multiple studies, and if the agency would consider an accelerated approval in Clene's case. And we'll find that out here in the coming months.
Wow, that's so exciting. How common is like FDA accelerated approval? I mean, I suppose what we're talking about is pretty similar with what happened with like COVID, for example, as well, or am I?
Yeah, so COVID was another example where a typical drug development process that takes years. Clene's been working on this for 11, so to say years is a mystery. It's many years. But in the COVID case, we accelerated drug development of vaccines very, very rapidly, and the FDA exercised regulatory flexibility to get these vaccines to market in a very speedy way. The same thing, again, happened in the HIV era. The same thing happens all the time in oncology. There are many such examples, but rare orphan diseases that are uniformly fatal without drug therapy options tend to be primarily, and there's a lot of that in cancer, primarily where accelerated has utility. But there has to be clinical signal, there has to be biomarker, there has to be surrogates, if you will, for the data that the agency can put together in their head. There needs to be a scientific narrative that makes sense and data that is compelling. And critically, the drug has to be safe. The drug has to be safe. The agency has a very obvious responsibility to make sure that if there is an accelerated approval, that it doesn't happen with a drug that's unsafe. And so that is one advantage that we have here. This oral medicine that I'm speaking of, CNM-Au8, we have well over 600 now years of collective subject exposure. We have not a single identified safety signal where there's been a serious adverse event that's been attributed by a clinician to our drug. In any of our programs, not in ALS, not in MS, nor in Parkinson's. Wow. We do have some side effects, but they are transient, mild to moderate. They tend to cluster around either some GI or some headache distress. But patients don't complain about these in terms of showstoppers. And we've got quite considerable long-term dosing experience now, too, over nearly 4.5 years of many patients being on our drug. And so that safety database becomes paramount. And whenever the agency considers a conditional / more precisely accelerated approval, the safety is a key piece that they consider, as well as the clinical efficacy. And again, we don't know what the agency is going to rule yet. That's a conversation that we'll be having with the FDA, as I stated, over the coming months.
Amazing. So yeah, from like the external point of view, you know, the BD side of it, can you just share a bit of behind the scenes, what it looks like, and I suppose what you guys are thinking, and is there a strategy, basically?
Well, as I've mentioned, one of the things we still need to resolve very effectively is better drugs and more drugs for central nervous system diseases of the neurodegenerative nature. And there's a lot of progress that is being made clinically, but much of that progress is not actually in the major pipelines of the big pharma companies. So there is an opportunity to, and it's happening all the time, where big pharma is able to partner with in a business development organization, the research and the science that is going on at small pharma companies such as Clene. And so we ourselves are right now talking to pharma of all sizes, big global multinationals down to smaller, medium-sized players, to see if after the end of the diligence process, if there would be a useful partnership that would make sense for both sides. We had tap-toed around this a little bit, tiptoed or tap danced, I guess is a better way to explain this, a little bit last year. But we've leaned into this more aggressively since our presentation at the American Academy of Neurology only a month ago, because at that presentation we showed with our same asset, CNM-Au8 in multiple sclerosis, that we were seeing some pretty interesting data over the long term of the ability of our asset to improve low contrast letter acuity, which is to say vision, and optic neuritis compromised MS patients. We also showed at that American Academy of Neurology meeting last month how that's happening by showing that CNM-Au8 was improving information signal strength and speed, what is called amplitude and latency of signals that my eye interprets from when I look at something to when it's understood in the visual cortex. So we saw physiological changes using a method called visual evoked potentials. And we also saw long-term cognitive improvement, which is a challenge in MS when there's lesions in the white matter. And we showed why this cognitive improvement was occurring, which is to say that we demonstrated MS, multiple sclerosis lesion repair, and promoted, we believe, remyelination. And those two things have been kind of the holy grail of need in the multiple sclerosis space. So it's enabled us to actually lean into pharmaceutical partnering opportunities by having a big pharma come and look under the hood and understand more about our asset and our data.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint as well, I feel like big pharma is becoming much more active recently compared to the last few years in, partnering with smaller up and coming companies with novel tech. I mean, one example recently is that that AbbVie deal with Gilgamesh. That one with psychedelics, which 10 years ago, would have been crazy. So I suppose when you say like big pharma hasn't really delved into this, by the sounds of it, it's coming.
They have. They certainly recognize there's opportunities, and they have the cash resources, and they have the need to take assets that are at late clinical stage, like Clene's. And that's one advantage we've got here, is that we have a fully ready to go, de-risked phase 3 ready program in multiple sclerosis, and that is for a safe asset to be achieved for a drug that already has a clear clinical signal from phase 2 work, and to be ready to go in phase 3 is unusual. So we will see how the biz dev opportunities play out, but that is one series of conversations we're now presently involved in.
Cool, amazing. Last question. So finally, I mean, you look at your career and it's pretty impressive, and I suppose from a recruiter standpoint, almost a little bit unusual with the longevity in each role and progression within each role, which is amazing. So for those dreaming of disrupting industries and their innovations, what advice do you have for sustaining that drive and creativity?
Well, first of all, I like to quote what the famed business author Stephen Covey said, that there's never a breakthrough until there's a break with convention. So in other words, do something novel that nobody else has really considered nor thought of. But that also is challenging because it's very different than, shall we say, the status quo, and it's very different than everything that's gone before. And that's exactly what we're doing in nanotherapeutics suspensions with a water aqueous oral solution built around a gold nanoparticle that is composed of atoms of gold. If that's not orthogonal or different than what everybody else is considered, then very little else is different or orthogonal. And so to answer your question, one needs to be resilient, and one needs to actually continue to press and to continue to build the evidence base, even when there's skepticism. And, and also, since one's pioneering, we have a lot of patents that have been granted here at Clene, and a number of trade secrets that we've chosen to keep secret. But when you're pioneering like you are, like we are, then there's a lot of walls one has to figure out how to either climb over or walk through or walk around to resolve, challenges that happen day to day. And that's been a little bit the fact of life for Clene for 11 years, but it's also the fact of life in pharmaceutical drug development generally. Diseases and biology and the human body is and continues to be a vexing challenge that requires resolution. And that's the reason that there's failure in clinical studies. And that's the reason that so many drug developers are pressing onward and working to solve some of these very challenging, devastating conditions like ALS. And the fact that we could potentially give the patients a drug that could improve their mortality and improve their survival odds in ALS, or improve their function in MS, and or improve their function over the long term in ALS, that's what keeps us going and pushing hard.
Yeah. I mean, what you're doing is incredible, and it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Rob. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Max. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
No problem. For everyone listening, please like, subscribe to the BioHub, and listen next time. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Max.